The bullet grazed past Maisie Winters' shoulder, so close she felt the heat of it kiss her skin before she dove behind the overturned wagon, her heart hammering against her ribs like a wild thing trying to escape. She had been foolish to take this shortcut through the badlands between Cheyenne and Deadwood, South Dakota, but the letter in her satchel had seemed urgent enough to risk it. A summons from her ailing aunt, who owned a boarding house in the notorious mining town. Now, in September of 1876, with 3 outlaws circling her position like wolves around wounded prey, Maisie wondered if she would ever see another sunrise. The Winchester rifle her father had given her before his death felt heavy in her trembling hands. She had 6 shots left, maybe 7 if she had miscounted during the initial ambush. The desperados wanted her horse, her supplies, probably worse. Maisie was 22 years old, a schoolteacher from a quiet Colorado settlement, and she had never killed a man. She prayed she would not have to start today. "Come on out, pretty lady," one of them called, his voice rough as gravel. "We don't want to hurt you none. Just give us what you got and we'll be on our way." Liars. Maisie had seen what men like these did to women they found alone on the trail. She would die fighting before she surrendered. Her finger found the trigger just as thunder erupted from the ridge above. 3 shots fired in rapid succession that made her attackers scatter like startled crows. Maisie risked a glance upward and saw him. A lone rider on a paint horse, his silhouette dark against the harsh afternoon sun. He wore a wide-brimmed hat and a long duster coat that flapped in the wind like wings, and he rode down that rocky slope with the kind of reckless confidence that spoke of a man who had faced death enough times to know its rhythms. The outlaws returned fire, but the stranger was already moving, his horse dancing sideways as he worked his rifle with practiced efficiency. One of the desperados went down clutching his leg. Another's horse reared and threw him. The third decided discretion was the better part of valor and spurred his mount toward the horizon, leaving his companions to fend for themselves. The injured men scrambled for their horses and followed, and within moments the thunder of hoofbeats faded into the distance, leaving only dust and silence in their wake. Maisie remained behind the wagon, her rifle still raised as the stranger approached at an easy trot. He held his hands away from his guns, showing he meant no threat. When he was close enough that she could see his face beneath the shadow of his hat brim, he stopped and dismounted with fluid grace. "You can lower that Winchester, miss," he said, his voice a low drawl that carried a hint of amusement. "I didn't ride down here to harm you." He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 26 or 27, with sharp features tanned dark by the sun and eyes the color of storm clouds. A few days' worth of stubble shadowed his jaw, and a thin scar ran from his left cheekbone to his ear, giving him a dangerous appearance that his gentle tone contradicted. Maisie slowly lowered her rifle but kept it within easy reach. "Thank you," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "I thought I was done for." "Those were Jed Hartley's boys," the stranger said, kneeling to examine the damage to her wagon. One of the wheels had shattered when she had overturned it for cover, and her supplies were scattered across the dusty ground. "They have been working this territory for weeks. You are lucky I was tracking them." He looked up at her, and something in his gaze made her breath catch. "Name is Zachary Ashford. Most folks call me Zach, Maisie Winters." She holstered her rifle and moved to help him gather her scattered belongings. "I am heading to Deadwood. My aunt runs a boarding house there." Zach's expression shifted slightly, concern flickering across his features. "Deadwood is 2 days' ride from here, and your wagon is not going anywhere on 3 wheels." He stood, dusting off his hands. "I have a camp about an hour north, near a creek." You can rest there while I see about fixing this wheel, or at least getting you something that will hold until we reach town." Maisie hesitated. She knew nothing about this man except that he had saved her life, which was something, but not everything. On the other hand, staying here alone with night approaching and Hartley's men possibly returning was not an appealing option either. "I would be grateful," she said finally, "but I do not want to be any trouble." A hint of a smile touched Zach's lips. "Trouble seems to have already found you, Miss Winters. I am just offering a way out of it." They loaded what they could onto Zach's pack horse and Maisie's mare, leaving the broken wagon where it lay. As they rode north through the scrubland, Zach told her he was a bounty hunter, tracking outlaws across Wyoming and Dakota territories. He had been on Hartley's trail for 3 weeks, following the gang from a train robbery near Laramie. Maisie told him about her life in Colorado, teaching children their letters and numbers, about her father's death from pneumonia last winter, and her decision to accept her aunt's offer of a fresh start in Deadwood. The camp, when they reached it, was simple but well organized. A small tent stood near the creek bank, with a fire ring built from stones and a rope strung between 2 cottonwood trees for drying clothes or hanging supplies. Zach was clearly a man accustomed to life on the trail. He helped Maisie down from her horse with a steadying hand at her waist that lingered just a moment longer than necessary, and she felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the afternoon sun. "You can have the tent," Zach said, already moving to unsaddle the horses. "I will bed down under the stars. I am used to it." "I cannot take your shelter," Maisie protested, but Zach waved her objection away. "I insist. Besides, there is weather coming." He nodded toward the western horizon where dark clouds were beginning to gather. "We might be in for a storm tonight." Maisie wanted to argue further, but exhaustion was catching up with her. The terror of the attack, the long hours in the saddle, all of it pressed down on her like a physical weight. She nodded her thanks and carried her satchel into the tent, which smelled of canvas and leather and something indefinably masculine that made her pulse quicken in a way she did not quite understand. That evening they ate beans and hardtack by the fire while the wind picked up and the first drops of rain began to fall. Zach had spread a canvas tarp over the fire to keep it going, and they sat close together beneath it, sharing the warmth and the meager shelter. Lightning split the sky to the west, and thunder followed seconds later, a deep rumble that seemed to shake the earth. "Storm is still a ways off," Zach observed, poking at the fire with a stick, "but it will be a big one when it hits." Maisie wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the fire. "I have always hated storms," she admitted, "ever since I was a child." Zach glanced at her, his expression softening. "You are safe here, I promise you that." Something in the way he said it made her believe him absolutely. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the rain patter against the tarp and watching the flames dance. Maisie found herself studying him in the firelight, the strong line of his jaw, the way his hands moved with easy competence as he tended the fire, the occasional flash of humor in his eyes when he caught her looking. "Why do you do it?" she asked suddenly. "Hunt men for money, I mean." "It seems like dangerous work." Zach was quiet for a long moment. "My family had a ranch in Texas," he said finally. "When I was 19, a gang came through. They killed my father, burned our home. My mother and sister made it out, went to live with relatives in San Antonio. But I could not let it go." His jaw tightened. "I tracked those men for 2 years. When I finally caught up with them, well, let us just say justice was served. After that, I found I had a talent for the work, and the West has no shortage of men who need catching." "I am sorry about your family," Maisie said softly. "It was a long time ago." Zach met her eyes across the fire. "What about you? Why Deadwood? That town has a reputation and not a good one. Maisie smiled faintly. My aunt wrote that she needed help with the boarding house. She is getting older and the work is too much for her. Besides, Colorado held too many memories after my father died. I wanted a fresh start, a place where I could be useful. You were a teacher. That is useful. Was, Maisie emphasized. The school board decided they needed a man to run the school. Apparently, a woman on her own is not suitable to mold young minds. The bitterness in her voice surprised her. Zach's eyes flashed with anger on her behalf. That is foolish. Some of the smartest people I have known have been women. The storm hit around midnight with a fury that made Maisie's earlier concerns seem laughably inadequate. Rain lashed the camp in sheets, and wind howled through the cottonwoods like a living thing. Maisie huddled in the tent, her blanket pulled tight around her shoulders, trying not to think about Zach outside in this deluge. She had protested when he insisted she take the tent, but he had been adamant, and now guilt gnawed at her as thunder crashed overhead. She was about to brave the storm and demand he come inside when the tent flap opened and Zach ducked through, soaked to the skin and carrying his saddle and bedroll. "Creek is rising," he said by way of explanation, water streaming from his hat brim. "I need to move the horses to higher ground. Thought I would leave these here so they do not get swept away." Lightning illuminated the tent's interior, and Maisie saw him clearly for just a moment, saw the water plastering his shirt to his chest, the concern in his eyes that was not for himself but for the horses and for her. Without thinking, she reached for his hand. "Stay," she said, "please, at least until the worst passes. You will catch your death out there." Zach hesitated, clearly torn between propriety and common sense. Another crack of thunder decided for him. He nodded and moved to the far corner of the tent, as far from her as the small space allowed. He peeled off his soaked duster and shirt, and Maisie quickly looked away, her face burning, though not before she caught a glimpse of broad shoulders and the hard muscles of a man who lived by physical labor. "Sorry," he muttered. "These need to dry or I will be no good to anyone tomorrow." "It is fine," Maisie said, studying the tent wall with intense focus. "I understand." They settled into an awkward silence, broken only by the drumming rain and the occasional rumble of thunder. Despite her embarrassment, Maisie found herself intensely aware of Zach's presence, of the sound of his breathing, of the warmth radiating from his body in the small enclosed space. She had never been alone with a man like this, had never felt this strange mix of nervousness and anticipation that made her skin tingle and her heart race. "Maisie," Zach said quietly, and the way he said her name made her look at him despite herself. He had wrapped himself in his blanket, his torso mercifully covered now, and his eyes caught hers in the darkness. "Thank you for not being afraid of me." "Why would I be afraid?" she asked, genuinely confused. "You saved my life. I am a stranger. A man who kills for money, if you want to be blunt about it. Most decent women would not want me within a mile of them." Maisie considered this. "I think there is a difference between justice and murder," she said slowly. "You hunt criminals, men who have hurt innocent people. That does not make you like them." Something shifted in Zach's expression, a tightness around his eyes easing. "You are a remarkable woman, Miss Winters." "Maisie," she corrected. "If we are sharing a tent in a thunderstorm, I think we can dispense with formalities." His smile was visible even in the darkness. "Maisie, then." They talked through the night as the storm raged outside, speaking of dreams and disappointments, of the people they had lost and the futures they hoped to build. Zach told her about the ranch he wanted to buy someday, a place where he could raise horses and live a quieter life. Maisie confessed her fear that she would end up like so many unmarried women, dependent on relatives, forever on the margins of other people's lives. She had thought teaching would be enough, but the school board's dismissal had shaken her confidence in ways she was only beginning to understand. "You will find your place," Zach said with quiet certainty. "A woman with your spirit and intelligence, you could do anything you set your mind to." "You barely know me," Maisie protested, but she felt warmed by his words nonetheless. "I know enough." His eyes held hers. "I know you did not panic when those outlaws attacked. I know you offered kindness to a stranger when you had every reason to be suspicious. I know you see people for what they are, not what society says they should be." He paused. "That is more than most people manage in a lifetime." Maisie felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back quickly. It had been so long since anyone had seen her as anything other than a burden or a problem to be solved. "Thank you," she whispered. The storm finally broke around dawn, leaving the world washed clean and smelling of wet sage. They emerged from the tent to find the camp largely intact, though the creek had indeed risen significantly, muddy water swirling where yesterday there had been a placid stream. Zach checked the horses while Maisie rekindled the fire and made coffee from the supplies he had packed. They ate breakfast in companionable silence, and if Maisie felt a pang of disappointment at the thought of reaching Deadwood and parting ways with this unexpected companion, she told herself it was only natural after such an intense shared experience. Zach spent the morning working on a makeshift travois to carry Maisie's supplies since the wagon was beyond immediate repair. His hands moved with practiced skill, lashing together branches with rawhide cord, and Maisie found herself watching him more than she should, admiring the way he moved, the focus in his expression. She had never thought much about men in a romantic sense. Her father's illness, and then his death had consumed her attention, and before that she had been too busy with teaching and managing the household. But something about Zach Ashford stirred feelings she had not known she possessed. They set out mid-morning, following a rutted trail that wound through the hills toward Deadwood. The going was slow with the travois, but Zach did not complain, keeping up a steady stream of conversation that made the miles pass quickly. He pointed out landmarks, told her stories about the territory, and answered her endless questions about his work with patient good humor. It was late afternoon on the second day when Maisie first felt the headache. She ignored it, assuming it was just fatigue from the long ride, but by the time the sun touched the western horizon, her temples were pounding and her skin felt too tight. She said nothing, not wanting to slow them down when Deadwood was finally in sight, the rough sprawl of the mining town visible in the valley below. "We will reach it before full dark," Zach said, pointing. "Your aunt will be worried if you arrive after nightfall." Maisie nodded, but the motion made her head swim. She gripped her saddle horn tighter, willing herself to stay upright. They were so close. She could make it just a little farther. She made it another half-mile before the dizziness overwhelmed her. One moment she was focused on the trail ahead. The next the world tilted sickeningly and she was falling, the ground rushing up to meet her. She heard Zach shout her name, felt strong arms catch her before she hit the dirt, and then everything faded to black. When consciousness returned, she was lying on a bedroll with a fire crackling nearby and a cool cloth on her forehead. Night had fallen completely, stars brilliant overhead, and Zach knelt beside her, his face creased with worry. "Easy," he said as she tried to sit up. "You fainted." "How do you feel?" "Terrible," Maisie admitted. Her head was splitting and her body ached everywhere, a deep bone weariness that terrified her. "What is wrong with me?" Zach touched the back of his hand to her cheek and his frown deepened. "You are burning up, fever." He glanced toward Deadwood, clearly calculating distances. "We are still 3 miles out. I could carry you, but in your condition, jostling you around might make things worse. There is an old line shack about a mile back. I think we should hole up there until this passes." "I will be fine," Maisie tried to say, but her teeth were chattering now despite the fire's warmth. "We should keep going." "No." The finality in Zach's voice left no room for argument. "You are sick, Maisie, really sick. Moving you now could be dangerous." She wanted to protest, but could not find the energy. Instead, she let Zach gather her in his arms and lift her as though she weighed nothing. He settled her on his horse, then swung up behind her, one arm tight around her waist to keep her steady. The ride to the line shack blurred in her memory, a confusion of darkness and movement and Zach's voice murmuring reassurances she could not quite parse. The shack was small and rough, barely more than 4 walls and a roof, but it was dry and out of the wind. Zach laid her on his bedroll near the fireplace and quickly got a blaze going. Maisie drifted in and out of awareness, surfacing occasionally to find Zach kneeling beside her, bathing her face with cool water or coaxing her to drink from a canteen. "Need to get the fever down," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Creek water will help." He disappeared into the night and returned with a bucket of cold water and several strips of cloth torn from what she dimly recognized as his spare shirt. He soaked the cloths and laid them on her forehead, her wrists, the back of her neck. The cold was a shock that made her gasp, but gradually the unbearable heat began to recede. "That is it," Zach encouraged. "Just breathe. You are going to be all right." But as the night wore on, Maisie's condition worsened. The fever climbed despite Zach's efforts, and delirium set in, pulling her down into nightmares where she relived her father's death, where outlaws with no faces chased her through endless badlands, where she was always running and never reaching safety. Through it all, Zach's voice was her anchor, pulling her back from the edge again and again. "Stay with me, Maisie," he said, and there was something in his tone that cut through the fever haze. "Do not go, please, just stay." She tried to answer but could not form words. Her body shook with violent chills one moment and burned the next. Zach stripped away her sweat-soaked dress, leaving her in her chemise and petticoat, and wrapped her in every blanket he had. When that was not enough, he lay down beside her and pulled her against his chest, sharing his body heat when the chills came and using cool cloths when the fever spiked. Time lost meaning. There was only the cycle of hot and cold, darkness and brief moments of painful clarity, and always Zach's presence, his hands gentle as he tended her, his voice steady as he talked to her about anything and everything. He told her about his childhood in Texas, about the ranch and the horses he had loved, about his sister who had married a banker in San Antonio and wrote him letters he carried in his saddlebag. He told her about the first time he had seen the mountains, about a sunset in Wyoming that had stopped him in his tracks with its beauty, about a dog he had once owned who could catch rabbits mid-leap. "You would have liked that dog," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Smartest animal I ever knew, followed me everywhere, loyal as they come. Had to leave him with my sister when I started bounty hunting. Too dangerous for him." He paused, and Maisie felt him brush damp hair back from her forehead. "I miss having someone to come home to. Someone who is glad to see me just because I am me, not because of what I can do for them." In her delirium, Maisie wanted to tell him she understood, that she felt the same loneliness, but the words would not come. She could only press closer to his warmth and hope he understood. The fever broke on the 3rd day. Maisie woke to bright sunlight streaming through gaps in the shack's walls and the sound of birds singing outside. Her head was clear for the first time in days, though her body felt weak as a newborn kitten's. She was lying on the bedroll alone, covered in blankets that smelled of wood smoke and leather. Zach sat nearby, slumped against the wall with his eyes closed and his head tilted at an angle that would give him a terrible crick in his neck. He looked exhausted, dark circles shadowing his eyes, his face drawn and pale beneath his tan. His clothes were rumpled and stained, and at least 3 days' worth of stubble covered his jaw. As Maisie watched, his eyes fluttered open as though he sensed her regard. For a moment he just stared at her, and then relief flooded his features so intensely it made her chest tight. "Maisie," he breathed, "you are awake, truly awake." "How long?" she asked, her voice a croak. 3 days. He moved to kneel beside her, one hand reaching out to feel her forehead, then her cheeks, her neck, checking for fever with the practiced touch of someone who had done it 100 times. "The fever broke this morning, I thought." He stopped, his jaw working. "I thought I was going to lose you." "I heard you," Maisie said softly. "When I was in the fever, I heard you talking to me." Zach's hand stilled against her cheek. "You did. You told me to stay. You said please." She covered his hand with her own, her fingers weak but determined. "I stayed because you asked me to." Something flickered in Zach's eyes, an emotion too raw and vulnerable to name. "I could not let you go," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not like that. Not before I had the chance to tell you." "Tell me what?" Maisie prompted when he fell silent. Zach took a shaky breath. "That I think I am falling in love with you. I know it is insane. We have known each other less than a week, and most of that time you have been unconscious. But Maisie, sitting here watching you fight for your life, I realized I have never felt this way about anyone. The thought of a world without you in it, it was unbearable." Tears spilled down Maisie's cheeks before she could stop them. "I thought I was dreaming," she whispered. "When you held me through the chills, when you talked to me, I thought it was just fever dreams, my mind giving me what I wanted." "What you wanted?" Zach's thumb brushed away her tears with infinite gentleness. "You," Maisie said simply. "I wanted you. I wanted someone to see me the way you do, to care whether I lived or died, to stay awake for days nursing me through fever just because I matter to you." Her voice broke. "I have been so alone, Zach. And then you rode down that ridge and everything changed." Zach bent and pressed his forehead to hers, his eyes closed. "You are not alone anymore," he said fiercely. "I swear to you, Maisie Winters, you will never be alone again, not if I have anything to say about it." "Is that a proposal?" Maisie asked, trying for levity despite the tears streaming down her face. "It is a promise." Zach pulled back just enough to meet her eyes. "But if you want a proposal, I can manage that too, soon as you are strong enough to stand without falling over." Maisie laughed, a weak sound that turned into a cough, and Zach quickly helped her sit up and take sips of water. He heated broth over the fire, simple fare made from dried beef and wild onions he had foraged, and fed it to her spoonful by careful spoonful. His hands were steady now, but Maisie could see the exhaustion dragging at him, the toll that 3 days without sleep had taken. "You need to rest," she told him. "You look ready to collapse." "I am fine," Zach insisted, but even as he said it, he swayed slightly. "Zach Ashford, you will lie down right now and sleep, or I will find the strength to knock you over the head and make you," Maisie said with as much sternness as she could muster. "You are no good to me dead on your feet." A tired smile tugged at his lips. "Yes, madam." He stretched out beside her on the bedroll, and within moments his breathing had deepened into sleep. Maisie watched him for a long while, this man who had saved her life twice now, once from outlaws and once from fever, and who claimed to love her despite having every reason to see her as a burden. Her hand found his where it rested between them, and she laced their fingers together, feeling the calluses on his palm, the strength in his grip even in sleep. She had come to Deadwood looking for a fresh start, and she had found so much more. She had found someone who saw her not as a spinster schoolteacher or a dependent relative, but as someone worth fighting for, worth staying awake for, worth loving. Maisie slept then, a deep healing sleep free of fever dreams, and when she woke hours later to twilight filtering through the shack's walls, Zach was awake and watching her with an expression so tender it made her heart ache. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Weak," she admitted. "But better." "Much better." "Good." He sat up and reached for the water bucket. "Because I have been thinking, and I have a question to ask you." "I thought you were waiting until I could stand," Maisie teased. "I am not a patient man when it comes to things that matter." Zach moved to kneel beside her, taking both her hands in his. His storm-gray eyes were serious, intense with an emotion that made her breath catch. "Maisie Winters, I know I have nothing to offer you except a life on the trail and a heart that has never belonged to anyone the way it belongs to you now. I know you had plans, a new life waiting in Deadwood with your aunt, but I am asking you anyway. Will you marry me? Will you take a chance on a bounty hunter with more scars than sense, and let me spend the rest of my life proving I can make you happy?" Maisie's answer was immediate and came from the deepest part of her soul. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Zach, I will marry you." The kiss he gave her was soft and reverent, a seal on the promise they had just made. When they finally parted, both were smiling through tears. "We should probably get you to Deadwood," Zach said eventually. "Your aunt will be beside herself with worry." "Tomorrow," Maisie said. "Tonight, just stay with me. Hold me. Let me know this is real." So he did. They lay together in the gathering darkness, talking quietly about the future they would build. Zach explained that he had enough money saved to buy a small ranch, nothing grand but a place they could call their own. Maisie suggested they look for land near Deadwood so she could visit her aunt regularly, and Zach agreed immediately, willing to go wherever she wanted as long as they were together. "I could still teach," Maisie said thoughtfully, "if there are settlers out our way with children who need schooling." "You could," Zach agreed. "Or you could raise horses with me, or both, or neither. Whatever makes you happy, Maisie." The freedom in those words, the absolute acceptance, made her fall even more deeply in love with him. This was what she had been searching for without knowing it. Not just someone to share her life with, but someone who saw her as an equal partner, whose dreams could expand to include hers without either of them losing themselves in the process. They reached Deadwood the next day, Maisie riding in front of Zach on his horse, still too weak to manage her own mount. Her aunt's boarding house was a sturdy two-story structure on the town's main street, painted white with green shutters and a wide front porch. A middle-aged woman with iron-gray hair and Maisie's same determined chin rushed out to meet them as they rode up, her face a mixture of relief and reproach. "Maisie Winters, where have you been?" Aunt Clara demanded. "I expected you a week ago. I was ready to send out search parties." "There were complications," Maisie said weakly, and launched into an abbreviated version of events. Her aunt's expression shifted from anger to alarm to cautious approval as she took in Zach's protective arm around Maisie's waist, and the way he looked at her niece like she was something precious and fragile. "Well," Clara said when the tale was told, "I suppose we had better get you inside and properly fed. You too, young man. Anyone who stays awake 3 days nursing my niece through fever deserves a decent meal at the very least." Aunt Clara's boarding house was clean and comfortable, if worn around the edges from years of hard use. She installed Maisie in a room upstairs with strict instructions to rest, then took Zach aside for what he later described as the most thorough interrogation he had ever endured, including the time he was questioned by a U.S. Marshal who thought he might be running with outlaws. "Your aunt is terrifying," he told Maisie later, sneaking up to her room with a tray of food Clara had prepared. I am honestly not sure if she approves of me or is planning my demise." Maisie laughed, the sound growing stronger each day as her health returned. "She likes you. If she did not, you would already be out on the street. Good to know." Zach set the tray on her lap and perched on the edge of the bed. "She wants us to wait to get married until you are fully recovered. Says she will not have people thinking you were coerced when you were ill." "That is probably wise," Maisie agreed, though part of her wanted to marry him immediately to make this real before something could happen to tear them apart. The fever had taught her how fragile life could be, how quickly everything could change. As if reading her thoughts, Zach took her hand. "I am not going anywhere," he said quietly. "Not now, not ever. You are stuck with me, Maisie Winters." "Good," she whispered, "because I am not letting you go either." Maisie's recovery took 3 weeks, during which Zach became a fixture around the boarding house, helping with repairs and odd jobs that Clara had been putting off for years. He fixed a leaking roof, mended a broken step, and installed new shutters on the 2nd floor. The boarding house residents, a mixture of miners, merchants, and drifters, took to him immediately. He had an easy way with people, a quiet competence that inspired trust. During this time, Maisie learned more about the man she had agreed to marry. She learned that he could not cook to save his life, but made excellent coffee. She learned that he sang while he worked, old trail songs and ballads in a surprisingly good baritone. She learned that he was scrupulously honest in his dealings, that he treated everyone with the same courtesy regardless of their station, and that he had a wicked sense of humor that caught her by surprise and made her laugh until her sides ached. She also learned about the shadows that haunted him, the nightmares that sometimes woke him in the small hours, remnants of the violence he had witnessed and participated in. The first time she found him sitting on the porch in the pre-dawn darkness, staring at nothing, she almost turned away to give him privacy. But something made her step outside and sit beside him, not speaking, just being present. After a while, he had reached for her hand and held it like a lifeline. "Thank you," he had said simply. And she understood that he was thanking her not just for sitting with him, but for not asking questions he was not ready to answer, for accepting all of him, including the damaged parts. They were married in late October with the aspen trees turning gold on the hillsides above Deadwood. The ceremony was simple, held in the boarding house parlor with Aunt Clara and a dozen residents as witnesses. Maisie wore a dress her aunt had made, pale blue calico with white lace at the collar and cuffs. Zach wore a new black suit that made him look almost unbearably handsome, though he tugged at the collar like it was strangling him. The local minister, a balding man named Reverend Walsh, who had seen more than his share of rough marriages in Deadwood's saloons and gambling halls, seemed pleasantly surprised by the obvious affection between bride and groom. When he pronounced them husband and wife, and Zach kissed Maisie with a tenderness that made several of the female boarders sigh, Walsh smiled and said it was about time. Deadwood had a wedding based on love instead of desperation or profit. The celebration afterward was raucous and joyful, with music provided by a fiddle player who lived on the 3rd floor and dancing that went on until midnight. Maisie, still not quite at full strength, tired before the party ended, and Zach swept her up in his arms and carried her upstairs to the room that was now officially theirs, at least until they found land for their ranch. Their wedding night was gentle and sweet, Zach treating her like she might break, his hands reverent as he helped her out of her dress, his kisses soft and patient. Maisie had been nervous, her knowledge of what happened between husband and wife limited to vague warnings and euphemisms, but Zach made it easy. He went slow, checking constantly to make sure she was all right, And when they finally came together, it felt like the most natural thing in the world, two halves of a whole finally united. Afterward, lying in his arms with her head on his chest and his heartbeat steady beneath her ear, Maisie felt a contentment she had never known before. This was what she had been missing, this sense of belonging absolutely to someone who belonged just as absolutely to her. "I love you," Zach murmured into her hair, "more than I knew it was possible to love someone." "I love you too," Maisie whispered back, "my cowboy who would not let me go." They spent the winter in Deadwood, helping Clara with the boarding house while they searched for land to buy. Zach had given up bounty hunting after they married, not wanting to leave Maisie alone for weeks or risk not coming back to her. Instead, he took work as a deputy sheriff, using his tracking skills to help the local law enforcement. It was steadier work and far less dangerous, though Maisie still worried every time he went out on a call. In February, they found the perfect property, 160 acres of grassland and timber about 10 miles south of Deadwood, with a creek running through it and a view of the Black Hills that took Maisie's breath away. The previous owner had built a small cabin but had given up on ranching after a hard winter killed most of his stock. Zach negotiated a fair price, and by March they were moving in, their possessions loaded into a wagon borrowed from one of the boarding house residents. The cabin needed work, but they tackled it together, Maisie proving to have a talent for carpentry that surprised them both. They chinked the walls against drafts, built new furniture to replace pieces that were beyond repair, and planted a garden that Maisie tended with fierce determination. Zach started small with the horses, buying 3 mares and a good stallion from a rancher near Rapid City. His plan was to breed quality horses for ranch work, and selling them to the growing number of homesteaders flooding into Dakota territory. Life on the ranch was hard but deeply satisfying. They rose with the sun and worked until dark, falling into bed exhausted but happy. Maisie did eventually start teaching, offering lessons to the children of nearby homesteaders 3 days a week in the cabin's main room. Zach built her a proper schoolhouse the following year, a small structure near the main road where families could easily drop off their children. Their first child, a son they named James, was born in the spring of 1878 during a late snowstorm that had Zach pacing the cabin like a caged animal, while the midwife from Deadwood worked with Maisie. When he was finally allowed in to meet his son, Zach wept openly, holding the tiny bundle like he was made of glass. "We made this," he said wonderingly. "You and me, Maisie, we made a whole person." "We did," Maisie agreed, tired but glowing with joy, "and he is perfect." James was followed by a daughter, Elizabeth, 2 years later, and then another son, Michael, in 1882. The cabin grew to accommodate their expanding family, rooms added on as needed, and the ranch prospered. Zach's horses gained a reputation for being well-trained and reliable, and buyers came from as far as Montana to purchase his stock. Through it all, through the hard winters and drought summers, through sick children and injured horses and all the 1,000 challenges of frontier life, Zach and Maisie's love only deepened. They had their disagreements, certainly, moments of frustration and anger when they snapped at each other over trivial things, but they always came back together, always remembered what they had found on that dusty trail when outlaws attacked, and a cowboy on a paint horse rode to the rescue. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Zach surprised Maisie with a trip back to Deadwood, leaving the children with neighbors and taking her to the finest hotel in town. Over dinner in the restaurant, he gave her a locket containing photographs of their children and a lock of hair from each. "I wanted to mark the occasion," he said, looking almost bashful. 20 years since you agreed to take a chance on a bounty hunter with more scars than sense." Maisie opened the locket, tears blurring her vision as she looked at the tiny faces of their children. "Best decision I ever made," she said softly. "Though I think I am the one who got the better end of the deal, you gave up everything, your whole way of life for me." "I gave up nothing," Zach corrected, reaching across the table to take her hand. "I traded a lonely existence for a full life. I would make that trade 1,000 times over." His thumb traced the wedding ring she had worn for 2 decades, now scratched and worn but still as precious as the day he placed it on her finger. "Do you remember what I said to you, when the fever was at its worst?" "You said you would not let me go like that," Maisie recalled. "That I had to stay." "I meant it then and I mean it now. I will never let you go, Maisie Ashford, not until the good Lord takes us both, and maybe not even then. I have loved you since you were too sick to stand, and I will love you until the stars go out." Maisie smiled through her tears. "That is a very long time, Cowboy." "Not long enough," Zach said, and kissed her across the table, not caring who saw, just as he had never cared about anything except making her happy and keeping her safe. They returned to the ranch the next day to find everything in chaos. The neighbors who had been watching the children reported that James, now 20 years old and headstrong as his father, had gotten into a fight with a drifter who had been hanging around the property. The drifter had pulled a knife, and James had defended himself, leaving the man with a broken arm and several cracked ribs. The sheriff had been called, but after hearing testimony from witnesses, he decided James had acted in self-defense. "That boy is going to give me gray hair," Zach muttered, but there was pride in his voice as he clapped James on the shoulder. "Good job protecting the family. Just try to use your words before your fists next time." Elizabeth, at 18, had already received 3 marriage proposals from young men in the area, but she seemed in no hurry to settle down, preferring to help her mother with the school and learn horse training from her father. Michael, at 16, was the quiet one, always reading when he should have been working, his head full of dreams about becoming a lawyer or a doctor. The children grew and eventually left, James to start his own ranch near the Montana border, Elizabeth to marry a banker's son from Rapid City, and Michael to attend university in the East, becoming the doctor he had dreamed of being. The ranch, once so full of noise and activity, grew quiet again, leaving just Zach and Maisie much as they had started. "Feels like we have come full circle," Maisie observed one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the Black Hills in shades of gold and crimson. "Just the 2 of us again." "Not quite," Zach said, pulling her close against his side. "We are older now, wiser, I hope, and we have a lifetime of memories to keep us company." "Do you ever regret it?" Maisie asked, not for the first time. "Giving up the bounty hunting, the adventure?" "Never." Zach's answer was immediate and certain. "The greatest adventure of my life was staying awake for days nursing you through that fever and realizing I could not live without you. Everything else pales in comparison." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars emerged one by one, the same stars that had watched over them that night in the lined shack, when Zach had refused to let her slip away into death. Maisie thought about the girl she had been, scared and alone on a trail to Deadwood, and the woman she had become, secure in the love of a good man and the family they had built together. "Thank you," she said softly, "for not letting me go." Zach kissed her temple, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "Thank you for staying." They grew old together on that ranch, weathering the years with the same determination they had brought to every challenge. They buried Aunt Clara when she passed in her sleep at 87, and they welcomed grandchildren who visited during summers and filled the house with laughter again. They celebrated 50 years of marriage surrounded by 3 generations of the family they had created, and when Zach raised his glass to toast his wife, his hand shook slightly, but his voice was strong. "To Maisie," he said. "The woman who was worth fighting for, worth staying awake for, worth every single moment of this beautiful life we have built. I love you today as much as I did when you were delirious with fever, and I was terrified of losing you. More, actually, because now I know exactly how lucky I am." Maisie, her hair white now but her eyes still bright with the intelligence and spirit that had first captured his heart, smiled at him across the table. "And I love you, my cowboy who would not let me go. Thank you for a lifetime of happiness." When Zach passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 89, with Maisie holding his hand and their children gathered around, his last words were a whispered, "I love you," that she carried with her through the lonely months that followed. She knew he had waited as long as he could, fought to stay with her just as he had fought to keep her with him all those years ago in the line shack. Maisie lived another 3 years, long enough to see her youngest grandchild graduate from university and her oldest great-grandchild take his first steps. She spent her final days on the porch of the ranch house, looking out at the hills Zach had loved, remembering the life they had shared. When her own time came, she went peacefully, and those who found her said she looked happy, as though she had finally reunited with someone she had been missing. They buried her beside Zach on a hill overlooking the ranch, under the same stars that had watched over them that stormy night when everything changed. The headstone was simple, bearing their names and dates and a single line that told their whole story. He would not let her go, and she stayed. The ranch continued through the generations, a legacy of love and determination, and sometimes on quiet evenings when the wind whispered through the grass, people swore they could hear laughter on the porch, the sound of 2 souls who had found each other against all odds and refused to be parted, not by fever, not by death, not by anything the world could throw at them. They had made a promise to each other in a rough line shack during the autumn of 1876, and they had kept it faithfully until the very end and beyond, proof that true love, once found, endures forever.